Everybody, welcome to Active Self-Protection Extra. We're here at SHOT Show in the Mantis booth upstairs where we get a little bit of quiet, and I have a real privilege today. I am here with Kleim, who is the Chief Consulting Communications Officer for Force Science. And Vaughn is an interesting guy. So I want to introduce you to him a little bit. So do you understand, if you know this, I'm an ambassador for Force Science. I dig Force Science and what Force Science does for us, but I want to let Vaughn talk to you about their mission and why they're so cool and why I'm such a big fan.
Wilderness Tactical has been around for longer than the gun you're carrying has been, and they have been making high quality products for concealed carriers for literally decades. I wear their low pro belt every year. The webbing is the best in the industry, and I won't wear anything else. If you're looking for a good CCW belt, check them out.
So my friend, thank you for coming and hanging out with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Tell me, how did you get involved with Force Science?
Yeah, so I started out as a police officer, as you know. I did that for about 10 years down in Topeka, Kansas, which I loved because if it was going to happen as a cop, it was going to happen there.
Okay, there's knowledge. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen in Topeka, Kansas.
It was going to happen in Topeka. The good thing is you could breathe between calls, so it wasn't like LA where you're going call to call. So I did that for a while, and I ran our DT program, and I ran our defense tactics program. I was part of the street crimes action team where we do a street level with gangs and drugs. I worked on our SWAT team. And importantly, I also did our communication. So back in the early 90s, we were already integrating use of force, communications, tactics, things that
way ahead of your time.
Yeah, but and I think Chuck Haggard, you know Chuck very well. Chuck,
you've seen Chuck on the channel.
Yeah, Chuck led the way. Chuck was actually my direct supervisor on the DT program, and then we actually switched, and I took over the program. He worked for me, and I think part of that was because he had enough of the
politics of dealing with
he was like, here, you got it. I'm just going to go to work. But I did that for a while, and then towards the end, the funny part was a attorney in court one day told me, when you go to law school, you can tell me how to do my job. So I said, okay, I'll be right back. I went to law school.
So wait a minute. So you ever know people that just do too much with the world and have too much talent and capability? This guy's like, well, I was a highly accomplished police officer and really good at what I did, and I just got pissed off by an attorney one day and went to law school.
Yeah, so it was a little bit like that. And so I did that, and I ended up after 9/11, I joined the military, and I was a JAG for the Army. What was good about that is I got to focus on constitutional policing for an entire career. I was a special assistant U.S. attorney. I ran a prosecution office. I was a police legal advisor for like 5 different chiefs of police during that same career. Ultimately ended up at the Pentagon where I wrote policy for the Army and for DOD on use of force policy, and specialized in what we refer to as domestic operational law. So it's how can the military operate in the United States.
Habeas corpus and all.
Well, right, yeah, and we looked at little posse comitatus issues.
Posse comitatus, yeah.
And so while I did all that, of course, when we're trying to hold officers accountable, I started understanding this idea of what I started coining as honest accountability, right? Honest accountability, we were just talking before, it requires 2 things. One, the standards that we hold officers accountable to, like with necessity, justification, reasonableness, it has to be clear enough that an officer can predict the lawfulness of their own behavior. And so we started seeing a whole bunch of standards rolling in that nobody knew what they meant. Like how would an officer, when they say, you must use a minimum force necessary, we go, well, how would anyone know in advance what that is?
How could I know what the minimum is?
Right, and even use only that force which is necessary. I go, necessary for what? So we would start to look at that, and they were trying to hold officers accountable to these really vague standards, which from a legal standpoint, fails under due process, right? It's they have to have a notice and opportunity, right, to at least understand the lawfulness of their own behavior. That was the first half. The second half brings me to Force Science, which is you can't have expectations on police officers or any human, civilian or police, that is beyond human performance capabilities. And so understanding what are realistic human performance capabilities. We were talking about memory.
Yep.
We're talking about
vision, decision making.
Yeah, so if I'm going to hold an officer accountable to what I refer to as a bucket of information, what did they perceive and what meaning did they assign to it? The meaning assigned took us into the idea of cops look at the world a little differently over time.
Training, background, and experience.
Yeah, and one more thing, training, experience, education, and reasonable inferences drawn therefrom. So when I look at that legal sort of lens, like what was their training, education, experience, and reasonable inferences, I just sum that as, what do cops know? And if you've met Lynn Westover from SLC Squared, he's got a great program where he's talking about helping officers identify the baseline of any situation. Where are you at? What's ordinary? What's the baseline?
Right, what's
here?
cool here? What's normal?
Yeah, and then what are the anomalies off that baseline? And then how to assign value to those anomalies. That's what we do as reasonable suspicion, right? When we're doing Terry stops.
Crimes afoot.
Yeah, exactly right. I like that. So I started doing this. Well, in order to understand the human performance, along comes Bill Lewinsky, Alexis Artwall, Chuck Remsburg, the guys who, Chuck Haggard introduced me to these folks, started going to caliber press training, started going to force science trainings. And what I realized is they were the first, Bill Lewinsky specifically was the first to really look at police cases and say, hold on, we want to hold officers accountable.
Right.
But you are asking for things that are beyond human performance capabilities. In fact, his early argument is you're not even considering human performance capabilities. So when I saw that, I realized that was a missing piece. So I did their initial certification training, I did their advanced specialist training, I did their de-escalation. So to sort of round that off, we understood early to be comprehensive use of force instructors and to honestly be able to evaluate these cases. We were looking at law, looking at police practices, looking at threat assessments and responses, looking at now video analysis, looking at what we call socio-technical issues, which is the political side. How is the defund the movement driving police decision making? We have to incorporate those things.
We do.
And so all of that allowed me to sort of get into this position where I became a conductor. I was able to say, look, I can help you analyze the legal piece, but more than that, I did over almost 20-something years ultimately as a cop, because I did 10 years full-time, and then when I went off as an attorney in the military, I stayed as a civilian cop. So weekends, holidays, I'd continue to work the street when I could. And that allowed me to really start quickly drawing connections between law, policy, practice, human performance, video analysis, memory issues. And so now I'm a conductor. We're involved in most of the high-profile cases in the country. We work with attorneys on both sides of the aisle, defense, prosecution, plaintiffs, civil cases. We work internal affairs. We do agency audits. Our analysis doesn't change. Just like you're an expert witness. We're like, look, give us the case, and we're not going to tell you what the outcome is, but we're going to tell you we're going to evaluate the same way we do any other case. We're going to remind you consistently what the standard is, because it's not binary. It's almost always, did the officer's decision fall within a reasonable range of options? So even if I disagree or you disagree, we got to sit back.
Even if it wasn't optimal.
Optimal's not the standard, right?
Optimal's not the standard.
Right, and that's precise. I would say one of the biggest influences we have is a constant pressure on our clients to remember what the standard is and to argue, particularly like if you're in front of a jury. I'm not asking you if you disagree with the officer's decision. What I'm asking you is, do you believe that no reasonable officer could have believed that fell within a range of reasonable tactical options? What's helpful, as you know, when these cases go to trial and they get appealed, and you've got 3 judges that say, I think it was reasonable, and you got 4 that say, we don't think it, you should by default have won the case.
Right.
Because you have 5 reasonable people presumably disagreeing. And if you have 3 saying we think it was reasonable, how can any juror say no?
It's outside of the realm.
Yeah.
No reasonable person. When 3 highly trained
with all the time in the world, videos playing back and forth, air-conditioned offices, debates, legal research, they still thought it was reasonable.
Right.
So when we see that, I almost don't mind cases getting to that level, because then we're just going to loop that back into the motions practice. Now, you can't argue that to a jury. Hey, 3 judges thought it was reasonable.
Right.
But in motions practice, it can become highly persuasive. And the opposing side has a hard time arguing no reasonable person could have believed it, when they are also aware that 3 judges ruled.
That'd be called perjuring.
Well, it's an ethics issue probably at most, but so anyway, that's how I ended up here. And Bill, I took over for Chuck Remsburg when he left. He was he wrote for Force Science News. So my first job for Force Science was as the executive editor of Force Science News, and then I grew into that into the consulting division. Ended up as the CEO last year, the interim CEO, and then I took a step back from that because our caseload was just getting really unmanageable. Trying to split that.
And you want Vaughn in court. You're really, that's where you are at your best.
I enjoy it.
Right.
I think that's half the battle. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah,
Like,
I enjoy it too. I
Yeah.
like being there because you give me 14 people to educate about a topic I'm passionate about. I'm in my best element. Let me talk to you about this, and I want to give you all the information you need to make a good decision here. And I don't work for either side, so I think, and I love what you said. So let's talk really briefly on this one. I've got more videos to make with Vaughn. The concept of honest accountability.
Right. Yeah.
Because I think sometimes I've heard a critique of For Science that you've never met a cop's actions you didn't like.
Right.
And I'm like, how do you come up with that?
Yeah. Well, and first of all, if anyone sat in our office, they would know how many times we've had to look at cops and tell them, hey, you're going to prison.
Yeah, this is not okay.
Yeah, there's no human performance or legal influence in this case that's going to help explain this use of force. The way this comes about is, look, the opposition's always going to throw as much and see what sticks, right?
Sure.
And the media, of course, depending on what cycle we're in, is going to pick that up. And if it's an anti-police cycle and they need to drive a narrative, an anti-police narrative, or they just want to get behind a specific case, one of the high-profile cases, then they have to attack the experts. And so that's sort of where that stemmed from.
Right.
There's not a cop you're not willing to defend. That early, Bill Lewinsky was saddled with that early because the media would try to convince the public that this is a slam dunk case of excessive use of force.
Right.
Bill would come in and explain, 10 other reasons why the officer may have performed the way he did outside of malevolence, right? Outside of racism or corruption. And if it was successful, you have an entire population of people who are already convinced by the media that this was a slam dunk case against the officer, and now the officer's walking. And who do they blame for that? They blame For Science. And I never run from those stories because, one, from a marketing standpoint, from getting our name out there, every cop in the world now knows, hey, if someone's trying to indict you
Right.
for a lawful use of force, we're going to stand in the way every single time of corrupt or incompetent accountability, right? So what we coined this idea of honest accountability because everybody wants accountability.
Sure.
Right? But
You don't want bad actors getting away with bad actions.
No, and we also see cases that have horrific outcomes, but the judgment, the decision were reasonable.
Right.
The outcome,
Awful but lawful.
Awful but lawful, and they don't like that either. They
Right.
would like to be able to railroad these officers and just say the outcome itself justifies your incarceration. ACLU and I had a nice talk out in California, and they came loaded to bear. They brought their attorneys. It was a takedown. They protested my arrival. Luckily, the agency that brought us in, the state brought us in, said, well, if you don't want to listen to them, don't show up, which took a little bit of bravery right out in California for them.
Yeah, no kidding.
So we showed up, they showed up, brought their attorneys, stacks of research, and just like you, I'm like, let's have the conversation, because I hope at this point you know more about your job than I do, right? I hope I know more about my job than they do, and that I honestly enter those conversations hoping to find what I refer to as and it's a fun word, it's called the enthymeme. The enthymeme is the lowest point of common agreement.
Right.
And so when somebody says something to me about the police that doesn't make sense, I'm like, what must they believe for that to make sense to them?
Right.
Because I'm going to realize we're unlikely to agree on that, which means we haven't found our lowest point of common agreement.
We got to dig down to find the point of common agreement.
And that's a conversation. And so oftentimes it's a complete lack of understanding of human performance.
Right.
And so I'll give you a great example of where that came up with an instructor who trained cops. And there was a shooting where the officer ended up shooting a driver because the driver looked like he was going to pull a gun. And the officer was not indicted, so there was some social unrest. And this professor says, well, he's got his gun out. He's got his gun. If he would have pulled it, he could have shot him. I said, okay, well, this is just a math problem then. If you believe that if I have my gun pointed at you, I have some advantage, let's do the math together. And so we started going through some of the research,
Sure.
right? How fast can somebody point a gun and fire versus how fast will you recognize they're pointing a gun, decide I better stop this and fire. And we know that whoever initiates that action at the speed of life, all things being equal, if he's moving as fast as I'm moving, I'm behind the curve. When I did that math problem, you can just see the cognitive dissonance. They had to change their position because the lowest point of common agreement at that point was if you have your gun pointed, or what he believed was the lowest point of common agreement was if you have your gun pointed at him, you have an advantage. I was able to change the enthemy, say, no, do you agree with me on this new point of common agreement, this new enthemy? And once he did, his entire conclusion had to change. Well, that's what we do in court, right? We're just educating triers of facts with human performance issues, with police practices issues, with reasonable inferences that cops draw from certain facts, things that civilians don't think about. And once we provide them that knowledge, we back away.
Right.
And
Our job is to be your data geek.
That's right.
You make a good decision.
That's right. So there's not a cop we're not willing to defend. I'm like, we don't defend cops. We just educate triers of fact. We educate prosecutors. We do a presentation. Nicole Florisi and I she works for Force Science. She's a psychologist working on her PhD. Also a police officer. Also has her master's in clinical psychology. So she's also a clinician. We do a class positive policing. Positive policing issues, and what we're trying to do is say, here's the context of policing right now. Here are the issues we're facing, and here's our strategy for attacking those issues, and here's the outcome. So we give them examples of all the cases where we've had really good outcomes. And one of my favorite ones is right now in this political, we're talking about George Soros and Soros-backed prosecutors and the progressive left prosecutors, and they just have a different set of government interests, right? When you meet these people, one, calling them a progressive leftist isn't bad. That's how they self-identify,
sure.
right?
That's who they are.
That's who they are, and they embrace it. They run on that platform. They take money for those agendas. They have a different set of government interests that they're protecting. But we have recently been getting hired by some of these progressive prosecutors, and we sit down with them and we use the exact same education. Sure. We show them the exact same research, and my favorite case so far is where one of these prosecutors was getting ready to move the officer into an indictment, and I looked at the case, actually it was last year at SHOT Show, from the hotel room is where I looked at the case for the first time. The short version of the story is there was no way she wasn't going to indict this officer. We got to sit down, and there was no way she was going to hire us.
Right.
She did hire us. We had a consult with her. We provided her the documentation to support our positions. And she did not only did she not indict the officer, she withdrew she found the officer was actually operating within their law, reasonable within their standards. And then she wrote a letter to the community saying, not only was he right, but you need to stop running from the police with a gun in your hand, because in our state, the police can shoot you if you're running from a violent felony offense with a gun in your hand.
It's been the set of the law of the land for decades.
Yeah, and they don't need to turn around and point the gun at the officer. Because as you know, the speed of assault is, he can turn around and shoot you at any moment, and you're not going to react fast enough.
Right.
So
that's a good, honest prosecutor.
Yeah, absolutely.
To look at the data, say, no, I want to get an expert opinion, take it, and then act on it.
Yeah.
Good for her.
Yeah, so going back to your original question, there's not a cop we're not willing to defend. Once we get our information into the hands of any of these prosecution, plaintiffs' attorneys, well, plaintiffs' attorneys are different because they're representing an individual. Right. They're going to make the arguments they need. But the prosecutors, overwhelmingly, they do not file charges.
Right.
That's not us defending. That is the prosecution looking at it and making an ethical decision that either this fell within a range of reasonableness, which is absolutely justified, or it's such a close call, they can't ethically bring it and prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So we've had a lot of luck there. A lot of the strategy of just educating them early in the process has been working really well.
It's one of the things I love. Like if I get hired by the defense and, hey, no, I'm going to get you that report and I want you to disclose it early. Because if I can talk and let the prosecutor come talk to me, I want a pretrial interview. And I go into that interview talking to the prosecutor and saying, listen, I'm not against you. My job here is to help. And sure, you want to ask some questions, and I want to answer your questions. Well, what do you think about this, Mr. Green? No, I understand why you think that way. Let me understand. So here's what the research says, and here's how this goes. And guys, I really think you should drop this one.
Yeah.
And I'm not against you.
Yeah.
I just think this isn't the right one.
Yeah.
And the good ones go, yeah, you're right, okay. Or they, you know how prosecutors are. In my world, sometimes it's, all right, we'll offer your guy a misdemeanor. And I go, you should probably take that.
Yeah.
let's stay away from that. And I get it. There's a different world in the law enforcement profession, but
They do have I think if you look how we've had to shift a little bit early when we were looking at these cases, they want to know about the decision making at that moment. What are the human performance issues that goes into that decision? Now, I would say, I don't want to give it a percentage, quite a few of our cases have nothing to do with whether in that moment they were facing the threat. As you know, the U.S. Supreme Court just took up Felix v. Barnes, which is going to look at sort of this officer-created jeopardy theory of liability, where if the officers didn't do enough to prevent the guy from attacking them, then they should be held responsible.
right.
Then they lose their right of self-defense. They lose their right to defend others if they did not mitigate the threat sufficiently. So if an officer doesn't take a position of cover and the guy tries to shoot him, they'll say that the officer was responsible because he didn't take a position of cover. If the officer confronts the suspect who's armed, which we pay our officers to do, right?
That's their job.
Then the experts are coming out of academia. They're coming out of PERF affiliations and DOJ civil rights divisions, and these guys are even to some degree IACP has people affiliated with, or certainly invoking their name, that modern policing requires officers to take more responsibility for their own safety, to mitigate the ability, means, and opportunity of the suspect, to mitigate intent through de-escalation. And if we believe after the fact that you didn't do enough to mitigate intent through de-escalation, or mitigate ability, means, opportunity by positions of cover, by closing distance, then even if the guy assaults you, even if the guy tries to murder you, you have lost the right to use self-defense. And this is, 5-6 years ago, we said, look, this is where it's headed. Now we sit across in trial from officers who have been indicted under these theories, facing decades in prison because the prosecution's argument is you created the exigency by confronting somebody and by accelerating a timeline artificially, even where the officer took over an hour of negotiating. They said you accelerated the timeline. Wow. So when the guy tried to murder another officer, the theory of liability is, well, you don't get to shoot him for trying to murder because you created that situation that allowed him to have access. So on its face, these are ridiculous arguments.
Ridiculous.
The problem is they're now being presented to jurors, and jurors, you don't want it to go to trial. A jury gets to decide who was more persuasive. They don't care about the history of law enforcement. They don't care about the realities of operating environments in a lot of cases. It's just who presented the theory the best. And you can sit there all day long and roll your eyes and say, this is dumb, this is ridiculous. And maybe 6 years ago, that was all we had to do. Now we actually have to find ways to convince these jurors that this is a manufactured theory of liability. And we've got to, and we're working really hard to get these officers acquitted, or they're going to prison.
Yeah, that's a problem. I got more I want to talk with Vaughn about. There's so much here because this man, he does it. This is a practitioner's approach, not a theorist's approach. This is, I'm standing in front of juries. I'm talking to prosecutors. I'm meeting with clients. So this is important stuff. So stay tuned because we got some more coming with him. Vaughn, thank you so much for introducing us to what you do, man.
Yeah, John, thank you. Appreciate it.